Dr. Aaron and I would like to welcome you to this session where we had this conception of many of us having had a very fruitful career thanks to the partnership with industry, or we have learned from people who have come from industry, or we have learned from people who have now gone towards industry. But you don't have to really be one or the other. You can really have enhanced partnerships between the two. And that's what we wanted to highlight in this session. And I'm very, very thankful for this panel. My name is Shumita Khatri. I'm a pulmonologist and critical care doc here at Cleveland Clinic. I focus on severe asthma. And I had the privilege of working with Joe and then also with Dr. Ortega. And he has really helped my career quite a bit. So I'm coming at it with a very personal lens. Some technical issues, just wanted to let you know that you will have the opportunity to unmute yourselves and ask questions at the end of the panel presentation, which is really when we get to know our panelists a little bit better, but also know that I'll be looking at the chat. So if some burning question comes up, please leave a question in the chat. I'll keep track of those. So I'll be the moderator, one of the moderators of the session. But I am also very, very happy to introduce my co-moderator, Dr. Joseph Aaron, MD, PhD. He's at Genentech. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Joe. I hope you guys don't mind. I think we're all friends here. Even though we're all doctors, I'm going to call you by your first names because that's the kind of relationships we want to foster here at our session. So let me start with Joe. If you'd like to introduce yourself and what you'd like to get out of this session, and then tell us a little bit about yourself.
And thank you all for joining in this session today. I was nominated to be the industry representative on the AII Assembly, and through a course of the last year plus, through the regular meetings, we were thinking about what is it that we could bring that might be unique in terms of a perspective, particularly to people who might be in training and or people who are, maybe more curious about actually what goes on in industry beyond, hearing about clinical trials that have been concluded. So we thought this would be an interesting idea just to bring together a couple of panelists who have very diverse backgrounds, as you will hear. And really our goal is to kind of demystify what it is that goes on in industry. So as Sumita mentioned, we're gonna each kind of introduce ourselves somewhat briefly and maybe just highlight a couple of points that we thought would be interesting for further discussion. But obviously, anybody who's in the meeting who has a question, whether or not it's something we talked about, we are happy to entertain your questions. So a little bit about me. I am currently a vice president and senior fellow in immunology research at Genentech. And I guess I'm a little bit unusual in industry in that I've only worked at one company, but I've been here for almost 15 years now. My education and training, I did a combined MD PhD program at Cornell and Rockefeller, where I did my PhD in molecular immunology. And as I like to say, I retired from the practice of medicine after receiving my MD degree to pursue postdoctoral studies at Stanford University in developmental biology. And I was really thinking about staying in academia. I had applied for a K08 award. I had applied for the Burroughs Wellcome Fund Career Development Award. And I started looking at academic positions when I was approached by a headhunter, a recruiter, who said, there's a company that is looking for somebody with a background like yours, somebody who has expertise in immunology but who also has at least some medical training and some medical clinical background. And really, the what they're trying to do is create a group that is responsible for trying to understand which patients may be more or less likely to benefit from targeted molecular therapies. And I said, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I've always been interested in really trying to apply whatever we're doing in the lab to something that would make a difference to patients. But I wasn't really thinking of going into industry. What company was it? And they said, it's Genentech. And I said, oh, I've heard of them. And, it was kind of naive at that point. But suffice it to say, after several months of visiting and talking with different people around the company, I decided to make the jump. And so I really started my first independent PI position as a scientist at Genentech in what was at the time a newly created department, which we now call biomarker discovery. And it really, again, the idea was that they had recently completed clinical trials for and gotten approval for two drugs in the immunology space. One was Rituxan for rheumatoid arthritis, and the other was Xolair for asthma. And there was this observation that not all patients seem to benefit from each of those therapies. And it might be interesting to figure out why that is. And I think where we are right now in terms of trying to do more what we call precision medicine, and really thinking about biologically and clinically meaningful subsets of disease, things were much more primitive even that recently. And so, to cut a very long story short of how this all played out, I was kind of thrown into the deep end where they said, well, we need somebody to figure this out. And I said, how do I do that? And they said, we don't know. That's why we hired you. You go figure it out. And so I was fortunate at the time to meet some pulmonologists who were doing research at UCSF, John Fahey and Prescott Woodruff. And they had just done something which, again, this was really the first time anybody had done this, was molecular profiling of bronchial epithelial cells from asthma patients and healthy controls. They had done microarrays, which was at the time a newfangled technology. And they had a very different set of questions about the data sets than I did. Their question was, what's different between asthma and healthy? And my question was, are there meaningful subsets of asthma patients according to the data sets that they had generated? And so we discovered what has variously been called the Th2 signature, the T2 signature, the IL-13 signature. The point is we were able to subset asthma patients according to the presence or absence of a signature of genes inducible by type 2 cytokines in the airway. And subsequently, we were able to extrapolate this to a lot of other pathological features, and importantly, to non-invasive biomarkers, which really drove this kind of stratification of thinking about different subsets of asthma on molecular terms. Since then, JOB has really evolved to both lead this research lab that's doing translational research in respiratory diseases, but I've also been given the opportunity and privilege to lead our overall immunology discovery group. And so this is a department which we now have 22 different labs in the department who are responsible for target discovery and preclinical drug development in basically everything that's not cancer or neurodegenerative diseases. And so a big part of our strategy rests on this initial observation that we had that, oh, there's some patients that seem to benefit from this therapy and there's some patients that don't benefit. Can we learn something from studying the data samples and everything that's coming back from our clinical trials to inform new target discovery for the evolving unmet medical need? And so because of the nature of what we're trying to do translationally, we've been very much dependent on academic collaborations. And I've had over 20, 25 different academic collaborations over my career at Genentech, which have really been nice because, as illustrated by the initial one that I described with Prescott and John, we had very complementary interests. And as it turns out, approaching some of these problems and some of these complex data sets from multiple different angles can really yield a synergy in terms of understanding what's going on. So with that, I would like to hand the baton to some of my co-panelists to give a little bit of background on what they do and how their career has evolved before we open it up for questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Anne Kazmar, who is, as of recently, my colleague at Genentech. So go ahead, Anne.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Joe. Super happy to be here. So I'm an infectious disease trained physician scientist. I've been working on tuberculosis for 20 years, which is my link to pulmonary immunobiology and to the ATS. I started off trained at UCSF and then spent 15 years at Mass General, which I truly loved. Started off, I started off with the patient in mind, and started off with caring about solving problems that had a human face. And in medical school, saw youth at risk of TB for the first time and thought, this is crazy that we're using tools from the 1800s to address this problem that we still have now, that's so prevalent now, that's causing stigma and suffering in young people now. And so I retrained actually after residency in immunology and spent 9 years at the bench studying new targets for TB vaccines. And at the end of that 9 years, I thought, geez, this is too slow. How are we going to hit the SDGs if it's taken me 9 years on my 3 targets? And in that setting, I thought about, where could I go to get an end-to-end perspective on TB, from discovery to delivery to country level programming to any possible intervention that could impact TB, and that led me actually to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where I worked for 5 years as a program officer on their TB team, and this was at the intersection of the discovery vaccines team and the TB team. So leveraging breakthroughs in immunology, novel platforms like BioNTech, novel tools from cancer like single cell sequencing, TCR sequencing, spatial genomics, and bringing those into TB. And then I most recently moved to Genentech. And I will explain a little bit more about that, but I was reflecting on what I hoped would be useful to all of you. And I guess I had a few thoughts. So the first is, we've talked for so many years about bedside to bench and bench to bedside. And it just turns out the ecosystem to benefit patients is a lot broader than that, right? I mean, it's basically, bedside to bench to potentially spin out biotech, pharma, to regulatory, to government, and then back through manufacturing and payers, distributors to the patient. And so just to say there's an enormous ecosystem involved in helping the patient, and we all have our part to play. And I feel so lucky as a physician and a scientist that there are many different roles that I've already been able to play, and that each and every one of us can consider playing in advancing, innovations for patients and advancing human health. So the first message is just, it's an ecosystem. It isn't just like you're a physician or you're a scientist, your academia or your industry. There's just a lot of different opportunities and ways to help. And then the second is that, breakthrough innovation can come from anywhere. And it can come from the patient. It can come from the first year medical student. It can come from any member of the care team. It can come from an administrator that clears the path for an intervention to benefit more patients or be more accessible. It can come from outside of medicine, like all of these health trackers and health apps. So I just, we need breakthrough innovation in medicine, and it can come from anywhere. And I think our role is to look for it wherever we are and drive it and advance it wherever we are in the ecosystem. The third thing I reflected on is this kind of idea of entrepreneurship. So I have learned a lot from Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter and Square. I mean, just from listening to him online. And he always says, you know, I didn't set out to be an entrepreneur. I just wanted to do something. And if I didn't know how to do it, I taught myself, or I found the opportunity where I could learn and do. And I feel like if I reflect on my time as a practicing clinician, you know, there was no hustle I wouldn't do for my patient. You know, if the patient needed it, I would do it. And sort of in reflecting about my career, it's now the same, right? So I want to learn and do, and if I don't already know how to do it, I either going to teach myself, or I'm going to go someplace that knows how to do it so that I can learn how to do it on behalf of advancing patient care, or bringing transformative therapies to patients. And so, you know, we talk about lifelong learning in medicine, and I just think this is a gaining perspective from the different parts of the ecosystem is another type of lifelong learning in medicine. And it's kind of like cross training, you know, makes us more nimble and more agile and more able to actually advance advance human health, deliver advances for patients. And what else did I want to say? Yeah, so the ecosystem is broad with lots of opportunities. Biomedical innovation can come from anywhere. We should drive it from wherever we are, and sometimes we have to cross-train. And that's basically the driving force for me of coming from the foundation to Genentech. I think that, you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is an incredible place that thinks end-to-end about solving human problems and leveraging, whether it's financial resources, political resources, country level resources, delivery resources, you know, transformative paradigm shifts like last mile health or like mRNA technologies. And it's an incredible place. And the TB strategy there basically is in place. And I saw that there are two last pieces of the puzzle that really aren't part of that strategy that I'm super interested in, that relate to latent diagnostics for TB and harnessing the host response and accelerating TB treatment. And those are things that are and can be and probably are directly related to the way we're thinking about and approaching that in cancer and unlocking cancer immunology in particular. And so I figured, why not go to a place like Genentech, which is the epicenter of, you know, I mean, the logo for our division that I recently joined is Pioneering Transformative Therapies for Patients. I just think that's amazing. And there's so many overlaps and shared host targets between multiple inflammatory diseases and cancer and TB, that I just thought that would be an incredible place to train and learn. And so I joined the early clinical development program to learn about proof of concept in people, how to design those studies and how to do that for inflammatory diseases. I love it so far. I'm brand new. There's lots of opportunity to grow, and the company, you know, they want me to deliver for the phase 1 early clinical development goals that they have, which means they want to train me to do that well, which is fully aligned with what I want to learn. So it was a little long-winded, but yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, and you just want to be in a place where you can learn and do. And I have found that academia and philanthropy and now biotech and pharma really have offered many opportunities to learn, grow, and contribute.
I appreciate that, Anne. Thank you so much. I love, first of all, I'm going to go back to Joe and say, when you have a chance, you need to let me know how you knew you wanted to retire so early. And then Anne, I love the caring about problems that had a face. And there's no hustle I wouldn't do for my patient, okay? Awesome. I mean, you're taking your hustling from here to there, and it's so appreciated. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hector Ortega. Hector's near and dear to me, and let's share what you have to offer to the rest of the group.
Thank you, Sumita. And my career, I think, has been a little bit unusual in some respects. I have touched on different fields throughout my career. Just as a form of background, I have training in allergy and clinical immunology at Tulane. Stayed at Tulane for a few years as faculty, but certainly my main desire was to make a difference in patients' lives. And I think there are many different ways to do that. Certainly, one is at the bed level, at the bench, in the lab. Um, but I was certainly trying to find ways to make a larger impact. And I left Tulane and I went to the CDC and I joined a program called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. I was an EIS officer where the basic task is to chase epidemics. And you may be very familiar with that word because we are still living in an epidemic. But that was the job of the EIS offices, really chase outbreaks and try to understand the genesis of those outbreaks and really have apply epidemiology and provide recommendations. So I have to tell you, during this 2-year training, I have phenomenal experiences going to Alaska, for example, and trying to understand the relationship between crab exposure among crab processing workers in Dutch Harbor, for example, and try to combine the epidemiology with some science and environmental exposures and really integrate that. It was a phenomenal experience. But certainly I wanted to continue that career and expand the opportunities to make an impact. So I transitioned to the NIH. I worked at the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And there was also a very different type of work, but certainly very exciting as well. I was project officer, a health scientist administrator, where I was involved in managing multiple projects that those are individuals that apply to RFAs, and they have a grant that requires and is administered by the NIH staff. But also you touch in a number of very interesting things, including guidelines, for example, NHANES related activities, and just by itself, the networks that are managed within the NIH. For example, in the old days, there was this network called the ACRN that was pivotal to really conduct clinical trials that generally the industry was not conducting. And it was a very selective number of sites in the US that were conducting these very high quality research that trigger and help to develop a more targeted program called SARP, the Severe Asthma Research Program, that was focused on patients with severe asthma and really trying to understand the biomarkers, the endpoints, the therapies that may be more likely to be effective in this group of patients. And I left the NIH, but that sort of program continued to evolve. And today, the NIH continues to sponsor other programs like AsthmaNet and so on. But with a phenomenal experience, you get to know the best thinkers in the space. And I think probably I met Sumita throughout that program. And that interaction and connection actually has lasted many years. So while I was working at the NIH, I was recruited by a headhunter who was talking to me about this potential opportunity at a pharmaceutical company. At that point, I'd say, I'm not sure I want to do that. Why I should move to the dark side? And I was avoiding that conversation for a while until I say, well, I'm going to give a try. I'm going to see what it's like. And I can tell you, in less than 2 months, I was already working for GSK. And it was a phenomenal experience. Overall, I spent 12 years at GSK, and it was a very smooth transition. The things that I was involved in included also managing some clinical trials. I was involved in phase 2, phase 3 drug development on inhaled therapies, Advair, Seretide, Flovent, Ventolin. But also I was involved and I learned about activities in medical affairs. To me, it was an entirely new field. By doing that, it was a great training. I spent multiple hours and doing activities related in the med affairs space. Very exciting. I never thought in my life that I will be involved in helping creating TV commercials. I remember when my kids were 5, 6 years old, I say, Daddy helped to create this commercial that you're watching today. And so it was quite exciting and a very different from when you think about. So at some point while I was working in those programs, I transitioned to a program with a biologic therapy. It was this anti-IL-5 monoclonal antibody that, by the way, had a dark history. There were a number of trials that failed before, and this is mepolizumab. But we were quite interested in seeing whether there was a subgroup of patients that could benefit with this therapy. And coming back to Joe's early comment about biomarkers and personalized medicine, this is really a great example where if you really look deep into the characteristics of the patients, but also in the type of endpoints that you want to utilize for certain drugs, you can really uncover these therapies that can be certainly very, very effective in a group of patients with clear unmet medical needs. So I helped to develop mepolizumab from early phase 2, phase 3 studies up to approval. And also we expanded with other indications, not only severe asthma, severe eosinophilic asthma, but also expanded to EGPA, nasal polyps, and set the ground for other indications such as COPD. I transitioned from GSK to another company that was for personal reasons. Family was in the West Coast. And that was when I met Joe at Genentech. I worked with John Matthews in the respiratory program with an anti-IL-13 program that unfortunately was not, it didn't move forward, but also had the opportunity to be involved with Zoller and some extension programs that were quite exciting. And from there, actually, I made the move to a small company, a biotech, Gossamer Bio, where it was certainly a very different setting. I was the employee number 40. And so you can imagine going from a large company with thousands of employees to a very small biotech. Something that was great about doing that, the decision-making process was quite different. You can actually get things done very quickly because if you need to talk with the CMO, that person will be likely next door. And so what I want to say to all of you is there are multiple opportunities in industry and even outside the traditional industry, the CDC, the NIH, etc., where you can actually find something that can be very meaningful to you and certainly to patients. So with that, I stop here and I'm going to pass the mic to Ben.
Thanks, Hector. So I'm the fourth and final here. I'm also I don't know if Ann actually joined industry before or after I did, but it's kind of neck and neck. We both joined last year. My pathway, of course, was even different from all of those you've heard before, in that I joined industry at the ripe old age of 54. And it's interesting because I also probably have the distinction of being the person on the panel who joined industry earliest, because straight out of college, I went to work for biotech as a protein chemist in Boston. And so even coming out of college, where I had performed a number of many months in labs there working on very applied science. I actually took a job out of college at a company called Immunogen and worked on monoclonal antibody targeted therapies for malignancy. And as part of that, I was trying to decide what I wanted to do next. And through that process, decided that I wanted to go get my MD and be done with research altogether. And so I promptly did that and ended up really in fellowship out in Colorado back in the late 90s, back in research. At that point, I stuck as an assistant professor and developed my academic career from there. Maintained an NIH-funded lab for over 20 years, looking at innate immune function, and in the last 10 or so years of it, looking specifically at metabolism and how metabolism affects the inflammatory response in the lung. Also did a number of other academic pursuits within the academic setting. Obviously, rose to vice chair of medicine and was associated with a number of other administrative duties. But toward the end, one of the things that I think I had realized that I was beginning to miss was, again, a sense of applied science, which was, it's more than simply going and seeing patients. I really have always been attracted to research that is directly relevant to patients and patient care. And even running a lab, I felt that I was getting a little bit separated from that. And when I looked at jobs in industry, one of the things that really struck me initially was the opportunities, particularly in early development. I don't think, and you can hold me to this later, but I don't think that I would have jumped to industry, nor may I, end up in an industry position on the kind of medical affairs side of things. My interest really has been, and I suspect will remain, really trying to understand how we can develop drugs that are very specifically targeted to underserved areas of patient care, whether that's asthma and particularly non-Th2 asthma or obese asthma or interstitial lung diseases. There are an inordinate number of areas of medicine that I think are really underrepresented in therapeutics. And this is not a failing of industry as much as it's an opportunity for those of us who really feel strongly about some of these diseases to get engaged. And that, I think, in no small part, is really what drove me into early development. I'm at Sanofi currently, and I've been there just about a year. And the other thing I will mention is that, the notion of, and we've already referred to it as the dark side, industry being the dark side. I would say, in my experience, industry is very much parallel to academia in many regards, not the least of which is the rigor at which we conduct our science, and the amazingly accomplished colleagues that we keep in industry. But also, and I think this is acutely relevant to me in my first year, is the mentorship. It's something that I think people don't really anticipate about industry, is that the same kind of mentoring relationships that exist in academia classically very much exist in industry. And I've been fortunate to find myself at a place where there is a tremendous amount of mentorship. The same way Anne is learning all about early development, I've been learning about early development. And although a lot of the science is really familiar to me since I spent the last 20-something years running a lab, the rest of it is new to me, and it's fascinating and it's really exciting. And so I think despite the fact that I am old by pretty much every standard, I really enjoy having a new career at this point, which really follows on a series of careers in their own right. I think that a lot of different aspects of my life have been different careers, even within one career. So with that, I'll end so that we have some time to discuss. But thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Ben. It's never the same without you. You have been a big help for me within ATS as well, and I continue to be a role model by the way you lead. So thank you. I am going to go with the first question real quick, and then Gabriella had a question about, do any of you feel that having an MBA or some business training is essential before we go into this type of field? So who'd like to go first? Hector, you want to go first? And
I certainly can address the question, and the quick answer is no. I don't think it's needed. It can be a plus, but I don't think that an MBA necessarily is critical. And more importantly, it depends on where your interest is. If it's more in terms of administration or meta affairs, perhaps commercial, maybe there is a little bit more of a link having that type of training, but that will be my overall answer.
mm-hmm. And thank you, Hector. And you had an up. Go ahead.
I did. So when I was still in the lab, people told me launching your own lab is like running a small business. And most small businesses fail in the first year. And I thought, well, good, that's not good. I need to learn something about that. And I first looked into an executive MBA program because one of the anesthesiologists at MGH was doing it. And well, that thing cost $200,000. And I looked to the MGH, they had a tuition defrayment program. And they're like, yes, we'll pay $300 a year for you. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not doing that. But I had some private grant money, and I put together through the MIT School of Business, a little sort of, how do you, it was a sort of self-arranged series of courses on innovation. What is it? Where does it come from? Managing scientific and technical professionals, sort of DIY finance for running a lab. And so I did, I didn't end up running my own lab, so you can ask, did it help? It didn't help in what I thought it was going to help on, but I loved it. I loved MIT. I loved these sort of scientists who wanted to do stuff in the world. And so it did inform sort of my thinking about what I wanted to do. I met a lot of interesting people. So, but it's not, I wouldn't spend $200,000 for that I didn't have,
Right. No, it's true enough. A lot of it is on the job and what you pursue. Many of us have interests and we don't need a degree. Joe, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, what Samita just said is I do think there is something ineffable about having gone through the rigorous level of scientific training that many of us have gone through. So if you've done a PhD or you've done a postdoc or you've done some sort of research fellowship and you've done something beyond what is didactic, so by which I mean you've approached a question for which there was not previously an answer, you tried to come up with a hypothesis, you figured out how to garner not just experiments to test that hypothesis, but resources to fund those experiments and troubleshooting and all that kind of stuff, and really all the failure that's inherent in doing research. I think going through that process maybe a couple of times early in your career is great preparation for figuring out how to figure stuff out. And so, to the extent that having an MBA is a basically, as far as I understand, MBA training is like doing a lot of little projects like that, right? And so I think for somebody who hasn't had that kind of academic experience, an MBA may be more useful in industry. But the other point I would make is that if you look at least in my company, if you look at the senior leadership, there aren't actually a lot of people that have MBAs. So our head of partnering, James Sabri, who employs an enormous number of MBAs who go out and try to find other companies that we can do deals with. He had an MD, and he was working in industry for a couple of years, and then he realized he wanted to understand science better. So he went back after being like the CEO of a startup to do a PhD. And, so I think there's there's a lot of ways that you can get there. And so I do think there's not much substitute for the rigorous training of, if you're going to be a physician, you got to go through medical school. But I think a lot of these other things, it's a little bit more flexible. It's really having an entrepreneurial mindset and knowing what your blind spots are, and maybe complementing those blind spots with partners or collaborators who have the type of experience or background that can fill that in.
All about just like a lab, having people who complement your strengths and bring something to the table that you learn from. Then, as you started, I know you're still in Vermont while you're working. So do you have people that you can go to when these financial issues come up? I mean, do you have a good group of people that help you, that you don't need to feel like you need to get a MBA?
Yeah, and in fact, I think even if I had an MBA, I don't think I'd be prepared to deal with some of the financial aspects of industry. I mean, in some ways, it'd be kind of like, I did Little League, so I'm ready to, lean in on a major league pitch. The finance piece is handled by people who do that. And that's one of the things actually it's interesting about industry is, in many regards, just about all of these functions, this kind of cross-functional platform and the matrix and things that people talk about in industry, it exists for this very reason, so that there are people who can do these functions at the same time you're focusing on really what you have to do within your realm. What's nice about it, though, is you can learn a lot. I mean, I've learned a lot from the folks on the commercial side. I'm trying not to learn too much from the people on the financial side, simply because it's overwhelming. But it's very easy to do this. I mean, yes, I am in Vermont, not literally outdoors as it appears, but I am in Vermont and will be staying in Vermont for a while. And it's never felt like there wasn't somebody available to really help with these issues. So.
Well, thank you. It'll be interesting to come back in a year or two with the same panelists to see how things have changed or what you've been able to accomplish. I know, Dr. Kasmar, I have a question for you specifically, and then if you wanted to invite one of your colleagues to also weigh in from the audience. So first of all, Dr. Kasmar, and industry and Genentech in particular, this is coming from Michelle Tureen. Industry and Genentech in particular have tremendous programs to support women in their careers. I know you mentioned how you curated a sort of curriculum for yourself. Has this been a noticeable difference for you?
Well, thanks for the question, Michelle. And I mean, I guess my most basic answer is I have a personal hero, and that personal hero is Sue Desmond-Hellmann, who was president of product development at Genentech, then chancellor of UCSF, and then CEO of the Gates Foundation. And so I do think, first of all, just having heroes who have charted the path before is helpful. And then I absolutely agree with you that Genentech in particular, and I can't speak for other places, I mean, they have an incredible, they have something called GWISE, Women in Science and Engineering, and they have just a lot of emphasis and focus on advancing women in science and STEM careers and advancing women at the company. And actually, there's it's like less than 1 cent difference in pay by gender in your role, which I've never been someplace like that. And then the first week I joined, there was the Genentech Women Professionals Summit. Soledad O'Brien spoke, and in that, I mean, every different technical function. So this is like manufacturing, chemistry, manufacturing and controls, tech, IT, like everyone had a senior level woman who was totally awesome, who was talking about how the company had supported her career and her career development. So it looks to me amazing at Genentech, and like a sustained commitment over many decades, actually, that has led to empowered and seemingly very happy women in positions of leadership. So that's great.
Fabulous. You have the mic, and you wanted to invite Dr. Patel, right?
I see Namish on the line, and how could I not call out another TB guy? We were postdocs at the same time in Boston. So I'd love, Namish, if you can and want to unmute and talk about your career as a physician scientist spanning TB and asthma and academia and industry, that'd be awesome.
Hey, Anne. Thanks for the shout out. Yeah, I appreciate it very much. Anne and I used to work closely on the TB group in Harvard a number of years ago, and I can only echo what you're saying, Anne, in terms of the immunology experience from my own research in HIV, TB that I used, and how it's been applicable to the work I've done in industry. I'm at Sanofi as well. I work with Ben closely over the immunology portfolio, and I would say a lot of people have been asking about what are the key skills, or do you need an MBA, things like that. I think the thing that I love about working with industry, that you work with a team of people that are very single-minded in their purpose. They want to create a medicine that really makes a difference, and working with that team and having that objective in mind, and being able to learn from the folks that you work with and also work with them, because you're a little bit different from being in medicine. You are not the expert you are the expert in patient care when you're a doctor, but you're not the expert in drug development by any means when you're working with a team of folks that there's so many complex parts of it. And being able to work with your partners and learn from them, and also exchange with them and come up with the best solutions. I think that's what I really enjoy about working in industry. And that doesn't involve getting an MBA. I think it just involves knowing how to work with other people and keeping the ultimate purpose in mind when you're doing that.
Yeah, I want to just expand a little bit on that, because Anne used the word ecosystem, and really what really refers to that is to Namish's point. There are different entities that enable drug development and really bring new therapies to patients, but it's really done in concert, where you have individuals in clean farm, where a physician can interact with and play that role. Safety is another that is critical to oversee the overall safety in clinical programs, but can be regulatory, can be toxicology, can be plain drug development, early phase, late phase, or post-marketing. And again, there is a whole set of potential opportunities for those who certainly are interested in participating in that network.
Thanks for sharing your experiences. I'm old myself, which it doesn't sound like at all. We're all just smarter and wiser. I feel like doing something different with my medical career. I am a pulmonologist and have performed research for the industry in many multi-centric clinical trials for the last 15 years. My strength is mainly at the bedside. Do you think there's a place for people like me in industry, and how do you recommend I start? Before you answer that, I'm struck so much by, Hector, your experience being an EIS officer, NIH officer, and then drug developer, because you must have brought empathy to that product development and messaging. So who would like to take this question first about, transitioning a little bit later when you've got a clinical background? Are they still the right stuff? Who wants to take that?
I could start. I mean, since I'm the natural fit, since I'm the old guy who went over. Yeah, I don't think that when I started to interview for jobs, actually, I remember talking to Ed Janito at Vertex, and I knew Ed from his time at Harvard. I just remember I asked him if he had any regrets about going over to industry, and he said only that I didn't get here sooner. So, I think that the thing that the take home from that is not that everyone should quit and, their academic positions and go to industry, although you're welcome to. The thing really is to understand that, there are a number of qualities that can be leveraged in a career in industry, and having a tremendous amount of clinical knowledge, history of working with patients, understanding things like clinical trials from the implementation side of things, like particularly as a site PI, this is really useful because there are not a lot of people who have that experience. And it makes it a real valuable asset when you are in the context of an organization that spends a heck of a lot of time setting these things up. I mean, I think it's interesting, in my role to kind of think about how much I do that's kind of intuitive based on my 25 years at the bedside. And the fact that is a contribution much of the time. And I really don't think that you age out of being able to start a new career, regardless of what your new career will be. In fact, I think you kind of age out of current career sometimes, and it's a nice thing to kind of refresh by changing. So
I just want to tag on to something Ben said, which is I guess maybe 2 points that I want to make. One is I think there is a value. If everybody went into industry, we'd have problems, because there is an enormous value in digging into basic questions. And one thing I always tell the job applicants, at least the people that we recruit into research at Genentech, are almost all coming from an academic position. We don't tend to hire other people from industry in the discovery side. Is you have to define for yourself. I'm not going to ask a loaded question as an interviewer, but you have to define for yourself, what kind of scientist or what kind of researcher or what kind of physician am I? Am I most interested in one little thing that I really, really want to get to the bottom of? I'm so passionate about this one topic that I will stop at nothing to uncover the mysteries of this. That kind of person is incredibly valuable to science and is often very well served in an academic environment. On the other end, it's I mean this in the nicest possible terms, more of a mercenary attitude, where you know that you're good at doing this. You know how to crack open a problem. You know how to define a hypothesis, design experiments, ask questions, learn from what you've gotten, and move on to the next question. And at some level, you don't care what the question is, because you're a scientist, you've got the equipment, you've got the training to be able to say, I can find what's interesting about this question and figure out how to get to the bottom of it. That kind of person tends to do very well. And what I don't mean is that you're a dilettante. What it means is that you are able to become an expert on whatever is in front of you when you need to become an expert on it. So it's, I just feel like this is an important bit of self-knowledge that certain people should have when they're thinking about this kind of question. The second thing I just wanted to pick up on a little bit is this idea of, if you have a lot of experience directly treating patients, that actually suits you very well at almost anywhere in the spectrum in the industry, because what we are trying to do is come up with an understanding of what drives unmet medical needs, so that we can deliver medicines that will improve patients' lives. And having that understanding of, you know, how does a patient present? What is their chief complaint? What's the history of present illness? That doesn't necessarily look like the black box way of thinking that I think a lot of non-clinically oriented researchers might think about a disease. And nobody looks like the exact diagnosis that we might define in a textbook or in the entry criteria for a trial. And so understanding those subtleties is really important. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Hector alluded to before, which is this idea of treatable traits, particularly in the respiratory field, when we're not talking about necessarily a binary outcome like alive or dead at the end of the trial. We have to think about what is the patient's experience of the disease. And so, you know, is the problem that you have frequent exacerbations that require intensification of treatment, but in between them you're relatively okay? Or is your problem that you have a lot of symptoms, you're waking up at night, you're coughing, all that kind of thing? Or is the problem a functional problem? Or is it provoked by certain things? And each of those different types of pictures of I've sort of described an airway patient, but you can imagine extrapolating this to other diseases, may be driven by different biology, may be driven by different mechanisms, may require different types of intervention, may require different types of clinical trial design, may require different types of patient selection. So thinking about it from the standpoint of here's a patient in front of you, they have a problem, we want to try to solve it, is a really, really good frame of mind for a whole variety of questions that might be asked in drug development.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Hector, you want to speak to that with your background? And just your reaction as to what Joe mentioned.
Well, yes, and I will emphasize that having many years of experience is always going to be an asset. So the person who asked the question is, I would say never is too late. I think industry across the board are always looking for individuals with experience. And in fact, it's probably more challenging if you really haven't had a few years of experience in your career and right out of fellowship, you're trying to find that transition. It's not so it can be a little bit difficult, but it's trying to really follow what is where is your passion, you know, I think it's important just to be curious. It's an area where if you demonstrate that curiosity, that can lead you to very exciting opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Thank you. And you put a great resource in the chat, Herminia Ibarra's book, Working Identity, about mid-career professional transitions. I love her. She's wonderful. I also love her book, Act Like a Leader, Think Like a Leader. Sometimes you leap to know what you're good at, which is something many of us in medicine are always feeling that we need to be an expert at it. And I would say even particularly women are a little bit more like that. So I think just leaping and trusting that you'll learn it is key. So thank you for that. And I have a commercial announcement, not a commercial announcement, but I wanted to mention that Michelle from ATS did highlight that actually more than 10% of the ATS membership is also employed by industry. The RCMB, AII, and clinical problems assemblies have industry working groups. All are welcome. And I think it sort of speaks to the one question, which is what we're addressing is how do we rebrand the idea that industry is the dark side? I mean, this is very important to me because I like people to have varied possibilities in their careers and long careers where they're feeling fulfilled no matter what part of their career they're in. So this is part of one of the steps to get there. Anybody want to speak to the dark side question?
I just wanted to emphasize that because, in fact, I brought that term to the discussion. In a way, is more to highlight the perception versus what it really is the reality. And many individuals probably are not aware, but in industry, actually, there is a very rigorous way to conduct research. And in my, as I mentioned earlier, I think my journey has been in academia, government, and industry, and I can testify that really I can see the high quality of research that is conducted at this setting. And so I think it's up to us to really change that perception of the dark side, and really bring forward the best of everyone, because at the end of the day, it really, the standards are quite high. The industry is highly regulated by the FDA, who is a very strict body that evaluates every asset that passed through review. And the standards are certainly very high. And so I think we all need to really keep that in mind, that dark side is not really the dark side.
It's a different
side. Yeah, and it's really a tremendous industry that has a noble objective, and to bring medicines to patients. And to me, I think it's also part of a driving force to be successful in your career. Put patients first, and if you do that, everything else will be easier.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to what Hector said, which is like, if you really want to make a ton of money, there's a lot of things you can do other than work in the drug development industry that would be a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah. We won't name what those are just yet. That's for a different session over drinks and supposing.
Well, I just think a more serious corollary to that is most of what we do is going to fail. And, you know, I think the way we need to think about these things is in some way, and it sort of gets to this question of rigor, is at the end of the day, you're going to have something that's going to survive a very rigorous pivotal clinical trial to survive scrutiny by regulatory authorities and be sold. That means we have to be thinking about what's wrong with this idea that I'm pursuing. What is the weakness of this clinical candidate? What can I throw at this to try to kill it? Because if we can kill something before an enormous amount of money is invested to find out that it's going to fail, that enables us to redeploy those resources towards something that might be more successful. So I think, you know, getting at this question of why are we rigorous? Because the stakes are really high. You know, it's not just a question of getting a paper. We like to publish papers, but we also want to make sure we've gotten it right. And you know, the consequences of getting something wrong are not retracting a paper. It's putting patients' lives at risk. It's putting enormous investments at risk. And so, you know, if that does anything to demystify the intentions behind some of the things we do, that would be good.
I'm sure plenty of sleepless nights go into those decisions. And Dr. Patel also mentioned about his perspective. There's some really wonderful resources and thoughts in the chat. I also saw Dr. Coles. Jay, you just asked a question.
Yeah, so the question, particularly maybe for Ben, since he's a recent immigrant to industry, I mean, this idea of some discovery occurs in academia, right? And you may have to push it along to actually get a company like Genentech or Sanofi or GSK to show interest. And one of the hurdles that you have to overcome is show that it's safe. But to try to get safety studies funded by the NIH, you get comments like, well, incremental, what are we going to learn here? So, any ideas about how to, de-risk programs at the academic level?
Well, that's a really interesting idea, Jay. I have to say I'm not sure I'm really equipped to answer, except to say that that was actually one of the things that kind of frustrated me when I was doing academic research, was the notion that so much of what we would normally consider to be next steps in really moving towards a patient application wasn't fundable. Because it was considered incremental, or it wasn't cool enough. The study section's like, well, that's really great, but you know, why not do it in lymphocytes? Is my favorite review that I got for R01. So I don't, you know, how we could do that is, I think, an open question for the group. But I do think that it would be great if we could do that in collaboration, because I think there's a ton of desire to do that kind of work in academia, and there's really no funding to do it.
So let me just interject here, because Jay's question is actually very, very interesting and provocative. When I was at GSK, I was responsible for managing the investigator-initiated program, where the industry was supporting academia with offering grants to conduct research, and these grants can be varied in terms of the amount. Sometimes it can be substantial, although in general are not, but sufficient to provide nice proof of concept or generate some interesting ideas. And that comes back to the early point of collaboration, because while typically these type of programs are a professor or creating an idea and seeking some funding, it's totally independent from the industry, but falls into their area of interest to fund some of those projects. But the investigator is totally independent to conduct her research, but that in our hands has led some projects that we have utilized actually to go to the regulatory authorities as proof of concept to move forward certain programs. I can tell you, for example, years ago, we funded a couple of investigators, one actually in Boston and the other in Germany. One had 20 patients with EGPA, or at that time was short Strauss, and similar open label studies. But those were actually studies that enable actually GSK to provide a package to the FDA for seeking an indication in EGPA. So I think that collaboration and support always helps. And at the same time, NIH offered to one of these investigators an R01 grant to continue conducting further research. So it was a very nice integration of government funding, academia support, and industry.
Yeah, I think Hector brings up an interesting point, just to kind of get at Jay's original question. Yeah, it's tough to get a molecule to the point where you are actually confident that you could do a mechanistic clinical study with it. And so kind of turning it upside down, these investigator-initiated studies for drugs or drug candidates that have successfully gotten through like phase 1 is, I think, an interesting way to go. And, you know, just a little comment on that, this was something which, not as investigator-initiated studies, but something we thought about when the COVID pandemic hit last year, which was, you know, realizing that it would be cool to discover a new target that might be the, you know, the Achilles heel of COVID and put it into preclinical research and all that stuff. People who came up with that idea last year are still working on preclinical research, right? Because that's just the pace at which it goes. But the way we thought about it was, do we have any assets that have already gotten through phase 1 and we could safely take into a clinical trial? And maybe they weren't the perfect assets, or it wasn't the best hypothesis, but you know, I was very proud to sort of launch the idea like, hey, we have, and I'll just say something that I know Jay likes, we have IL-22 that, we're in phase 2 for inflammatory bowel disease. Maybe this has an effect. There is enough literature and we had some preclinical data. Maybe this is going to do something in COVID patients. We did the trial and the results are still pending from that. But I think thinking about it that way, looking around, does somebody have something that would enable you to test a clinical idea? I would say if you've discovered something in your academic lab and you really wanted to develop it, that's something where like a tech transfer office or working with venture capitalists or launching a small company to get it to that point might be a way to do it, rather than trying to do it all yourself in your academic lab.
Well, do anybody have any closing thoughts? You are all, by the way, who are attending, are all able to come off mute. This is the time for it to become the bazaar where you can ask questions. Oh, hello, everybody. Oh, it's so nice to see you.
I have a question. Good afternoon. I'm Olemaris Narvaez. I'm an MD PhD trainee. I just finished now my PhD at UT MD Anderson. I'm going now back to med school. And I'm interested in doing the pediatrics physician scientist pathway and then do my subspecialization in pulmonary. But I've been reading and listening a lot about doing the jump into the industry because one of my main research interests is rare genetics and lung disorders. So I wanted to ask you if can one still continue to see patients while one is in the industry side? And also, like, I would like to be able to integrate because, like Dr. Surratt mentioned, like when one is in an academic position, rare diseases is rarely ever funded. They actually don't see that much value to some. So that's one of my passions. So I wanted to know more about that. Oh, thank you, Gabriela.
Who wants to take that? I can tell you that I know a couple people who were able to have that very unique collaboration, but Hector.
Yeah, I will say that it generally it will depend on what particular job you have in industry, but in general, the industry that tends to be very supportive if you continue to, if you have the desire to continue seeing patients. It will not be with the frequency that you used to, but once a week or so, it's certainly not only allowed, but often even encouraged. I can tell you, I personally still volunteer for a clinic, asthma clinic. This was pre-pandemic. That clinic was closed due to the pandemic, but it's in TJ where I volunteered to an underserved community and helped me actually to practice my Spanish. And so it's great still enabling that contact with patients. But I do that on Saturdays, so that's not that much of a conflict. But yes, I think that the option is there.
Okay, thank you. It's because I want to be able to also follow up closely the patients that of these rare disorders as well as part of my cohort while I'm also doing research. So I wanted to see if that's actually even a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think a lot of people who do this may, whatever they're doing clinically in terms of seeing patients, may be a continuation of what they did before, and it may not have direct relevance to whatever they're doing at the company, but it's definitely encouraged to, I think a lot of companies make efforts to create that opportunity for their employees.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I think being in touch with the clinical realm helps. I mean, even in my 20-year career, so much has changed. We're much more patient-centered. We're much more talking about racial and health disparities. And if you're not in tune with what is actually happening on the ground, you can be in an ivory tower and have no sense that what you're actually coming up with has no relevance. So it's always good to have those boundary spanners. Anybody else with other questions they'd like to unmute? So Amir is giving some very, would you like to unmute Amir, Dr. Zeki? You're putting some very profound things in your chat. We'd like to hear that before we, are you willing to unmute?
Yeah, hello there.
Hi.
Thanks everyone. Very interesting. I'm sorry I ended up joining maybe about 15 minutes or so late into the conference, so I only heard Dr. Ortega there. So I hope I can get access to what's been recorded to hear the rest of everybody. But really, this question has to do more with the scientist in an academic center or physician scientist who is developing something in the lab, and he or she realizes that this is something that really should get to patients quickly. And as the question that was raised by Dr. Coles earlier, and the comment by Dr. Surratt on this issue of, okay, this is great for safety and patient development, but you go to NIH and that will be rebuffed very quickly because it's not going to the next mechanistic question, which is totally appropriate because that's what NIH is really geared for. So you're kind of in this no man's land where this can be developed rather quickly. There is an acceptable safety profile. Your only other options are SBIR, SCTR, or forming a company. The pathway of what the NIH provides for the SBIR SCTR is great, but it's often a small amount of money, not really enough to get you moving as fast as you really need to move. Industry is great. It has a lot of resources. You can move very quickly, but you can't really break into that, coming out with, an idea that you develop from one of your grants that you think can get to patients quickly. So there really is no clear pathway. And there's this great, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure, great valley of death between discovery and what industry will actually develop. So massive amounts of NIH investment and ideas, 99.9% will die in the great valley of death between discovery and what actually gets to patient. And that's a real shame because that's energy, industry. I mean, it's NIH dollars, taxpayer dollars. So I think it's high time that all of us in academia and in industry and NIH figure out a pathway to help, the folks who are in that sort of no man's land to find a way forward. Because I think if we do that, then we may really start to have true engagement between academia and industry and accelerate things from that level. And I think that the COVID crisis has been one example of how that can happen quickly.
I mean, this is so true. I'm wondering, I can see us being maybe a nucleus of this movement on how to move things forward. This is a very compelling question, and even having a workshop on how to reduce that valley of death.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me it might be useful to involve some people from the venture capital community or angel investor community to get involved in it right now at this particular point in history. And this is definitely a cyclical phenomenon. There's a ton of money in venture capital for life sciences, and there are tons of VCs looking for an idea to support.
Right.
I do think one of the things that we don't have time to get into it at this point, but there, I think the gap between an idea for somebody who's, a clinician scientist in academia and the actual, sausage making of getting this to the point where it can be a viable clinical candidate requires quite a bit of expertise and investment that, as you point out, doesn't really fall under the purview of the kind of things that NIH would fund. I would just comment here that a former head of Genentech Research and Early Development, Mike Varney, gave what I think is the best definition of the word innovation that I've ever heard. People throw around the term innovation, I think, a little bit too cavalierly. It's even in the name of this center that we are participating in right now. Innovation has two components that are equally important. There's creative idea and successful reduction to practice. If you don't have both of those things, it's not innovative. And so I think what you're really driving at is how do you take that idea and put it into practice? And that's what we're going to need to bridge the valley of death, right? And at this point, we definitely don't have enough time, nor is this the venue to discuss things about the way the healthcare system is organized and how incentives are such that even in industry, it often favors incrementalism over taking big risks. And so, this is a much bigger discussion for all of us. But if you have an idea, There are angel investors and venture capitalists out there who might be willing to work with you to think about how to turn this into something.
Fabulous. And thank you to Michelle for giving us all of this information in the chat about trying to connect with Dr. Roosh at NHLBI, who could be a great resource for this innovation office at the NHLBI area. So she'll be at the booth at ATS 2021 NHLB booth. So all of that is in the chat. I've saved the chat, I think, 10 times by now, because there's just such a rich materials here. So what is the recommendation for transitioning from field-based medical affairs to clinical discovery?
I will start just to offer some guidance here. And I think comes back to the early comment I made. It's being curious and being interested in a particular area. And you can make yourself the expert on a given area. And so if you know in your company or wherever you are, a particular area that you're interested, read, study, get familiar with the aspects that are surrounded, and approach, make connections. One of the fundamental aspects of these success in this field, in this career, is network. And I think you should value that and establish and expand your network as much as possible. And as you become the expert in that particular area, a transition will be much easier.
Thank you for that, Hector. One takeaway, one pearl of wisdom, and we'll end with Joe, and then you wrap it up, Joe. And your pearl, the pearl of wisdom.
I was totally not prepared for that.
Okay. I know you've got 10. Give us one.
I just think it's fun, related to the last question, like whatever's interesting you, just follow that thread of what's interesting right now to what's interesting next. And that'll lead you from opportunity to opportunity.
Thank you, Anne. Ben, your pearl.
I guess I would follow on what Anne said. I think as we were sitting here talking about the valley of death, of which there are so many, I was thinking about one of the motivations I had for actually going to industry, which was that I actually had what was called a Spark grant at UVM, and there are Spark started at Stanford, but there are Spark programs many places now. And when you, just as an aside, if you're thinking about trying to take an idea commercial, you should very much look to the Spark programs if there's one local, or see about starting one at your own place. But I have to say my experience was that I had an idea for treatment for SIRS and sepsis, and one of the most frustrating experiences I had was running up against the wall of trying to really get past that academic barrier into the industry application of it. And so I think you have to just kind of follow what your interests are, and I wouldn't say that there is a decision point you need to have or a timing or anything else like that. I think you basically want to just go with what you're interested in, because if you're not interested in something, you're not going to be good at it anyway. That's just how it is, right?
All right, Joe, closing thoughts and next steps.
Yeah, so I just want to thank really the panelists for jumping in on a Sunday afternoon and sharing with us, and really all of the participants for a very lively session. You vastly exceeded my expectations. I was a little worried there would be more panelists than audience members, but clearly that was not the case. So thank you all for your questions. I think we learned, I certainly learned a lot from hearing other people's stories and seeing the kind of questions that are being asked. I hope that we've, to some extent, demystified what goes on in industry. And I guess if I have just one last thing to leave you all with is that, getting the science right is incredibly important. But there's 99 other things that are equally as important in successful drug development, and those represent opportunities for people with the kind of training and background that we all have to come together and work on teams and try to bring innovative new therapies to patients with unmet needs. Yes, thanks to the ATS and thanks to Sumita, my co-chair, for really helping think through what we wanted to talk about here. So looks like we're right at time. So peace out.